I'll try to explain what I mean by that. I want to talk about the state of affairs in Afghanistan today.
Louder, please.
State of affairs in Afghanistan today, which I don't know if people know, is now the longest war in American history. It's gone on for 10 years. And the way it looks like on the ground now is it will continue for 10 more years, 20 more years. That's right. And I'll try to explain that by way of an example. I have a friend who was sleeping at home one night in Afghanistan. He's an Afghan. And around 3 or 4 in the morning, he heard a loud explosion in his home. All of a sudden, men rushed into the room, bright lights, voices were speaking, and he couldn't. Yeah, he didn't know what was happening. In the next room, more voices were speaking. Men are rushing into the next room. He heard somebody scream. He heard his relatives in the next room start begging and saying that we're unarmed, we surrender, we're not doing anything. Then he heard gunshots, then he heard silence in the next room. Everybody was killed. Later on, when he went and saw what happened, people were tied to the bedposts and summarily executed. In his room, where he was, everybody was rounded up. This turned out to be the U.S. Special Forces who were doing this. They took everybody in the room, rounded everybody up, took them to a secret prison in Kandahar. They kept my friend in a cage for 1 month. It's about 4 feet high, about 6 feet wide. And over the course of a month, they administered electric shocks to him. And finally released him after they realized they had the wrong person. This sort of thing happens all the time in Afghanistan. This is sort of an essential element to the experience of war in Afghanistan, experience of occupation. But there's more to this story, and I think looking at this story, it's a little complicated, bear with me, because looking at this story, I think you can actually learn a lot about what's happening with the United States in Afghanistan. And my friend who was there, who had gotten raided, he was related to the district governor, who worked for the Afghan government. District governor is like a county, the head of a county here in the United States. He was related to the governor, and he was raided, or his house or his compound was raided because there was another person in that same district who wanted the position of district governor, sort of a rival. And so he went and told the Americans that, guess what, this guy's Al-Qaeda, this guy's Taliban, go raid them. So they went and raided, didn't ask any questions, killed all those people. The reason the rival wanted the position of district governorship is because there was a U.S. base in that district. And whoever is the governor of that district has access to extraordinary resources by way of contracts, logistics contracts, private security contracts. For example, the district governor in that area typically is a person who provides security for the American base. So the Americans give him millions of dollars and he hires men and they really want to protect the base. So all the bases in Afghanistan have private security made up of local Afghans like this. And so in this way, this person saw the American presence as a big dollar sign, as a way to get these really lucrative contracts. And this is a major element in the war in Afghanistan. I think one that's not really talked about a lot in coverage of the war, which is the way in which, on one hand, the U.S. presence in Afghanistan is a fundamentally destabilizing force in Afghanistan and the region, in Pakistan and everywhere else. Beyond that, the millions of dollars the U.S. is pouring into the country is also a fundamentally destabilizing force in Afghanistan. What it's doing is it's incentivizing violence in the country. A quote from a friend of mine, Neil Rosen, who, in talking about Iraq, said that oil was a major resource that really changed the dynamics of local politics in Iraq, and which oil was a resource which people fought over in their own ways. It depended who had access to the government. It depended on it changed the fact of who had access to the Sunni Triangle. People were fighting over the access to oil, which was a major force. In Afghanistan, there's no oil, but the major resource that people are fighting over in Afghanistan is the U.S., actually, in some ways. Is U.S. contracts, is U.S. logistics, and the money that the U.S. is pouring in. That's sort of the oil. People talk about poppies and drugs in Afghanistan, what drugs fuel the conflict. I think that's overstated. What really fuels the conflict is the money that the U.S. is pouring in addition to their presence. And it's a racket. The whole thing is a racket, starting from here in D.C. You have major multinational corporations, Bechtel and Halliburton, etc., who get massive contracts from D.C., from the government, to either do construction or development projects or private security, what have you, millions of dollars, and they'll go and subcontract that out to locals in Afghanistan. The people they subcontract that out to are warlords and commanders, people with a history of human rights abuses, And in fact, over the last 10 years or so, what we've seen with the U.S. presence and intervention is the development of a new class cast of warlords in Afghanistan. Most of them are in their 20s and 30s. They've gotten extremely rich off the contracts the U.S. is doing. Throughout the South, particularly, which is where the brunt of the war is being fought, in every district you have strong men like this. And what's interesting about this dynamic is that what they've done is they've set up a network of people, commanders and warlords, who have an inbuilt interest in never having the U.S. lead. They want the U.S. to be there for them. As long as the United States is there, the bravery train is coming. Right? And these are commanders who, in their own ways, manipulate the conflict, local conflict, to make sure that the levels of violence remain high. And that includes rapacious, abusive commanders who go and mistreat the local population and drive people into the arms of the Taliban into the arms of the insurgency. It includes people like the case I just described who would side with the Americans very selectively to knock out their own rivals. It's very like mafia style. Even cases where there's U.S. allied commanders who are also secretly working with the Taliban, playing both sides to make sure that there's a level of violence. And this is one of the major reasons why every year we have not seen an abatement of violence at all. In fact, it's quite the opposite. 2011 is shaping up to be the most violent year in Afghanistan in the last decade, or even more than that. Every year we're breaking records. This is the worst year for civilians in terms of the number of civilians killed. It's the worst year even for U.S. troops in terms of the number of U.S. troops killed. And that looks like it's going to continue, I think, in perpetuity. What the U.S. in Afghanistan today, I think what they want is, yes, I think what Michael Schwartz said about the U.S. losing in Iraq is very true, but at the same time they're being able to sell the idea that they won in Iraq to the U.S., to us, right? And I think if they can get to that point in Afghanistan, I think it's the best case scenario for them right now, to sell that idea, which is to have the levels of violence drop down to an acceptable amount that they can say, guess what, we've won. We can draw down our troops to a minimum number that we can maintain in sort of archipelago of permanent bases in the region. We can all forget about Afghanistan over here. We can forget that there's even a war or anything happening. Move on to other things. I think that's the end state that the U.S. would like at this point. But given that the very system that the U.S. has put into place in Afghanistan of creating this class of warlords and commanders, I think even that is unlikely. Even dropping levels of violence down to sort of manageable levels is unlikely because, again, the U.S. has incentivized a system in place there where people want to continue the violence. Just to give an example, there's a commander in one province who runs private security for U.S. convoys. And these are logistics convoys. So these are convoys that are bringing supplies to troops, various basic supplies to troops. Okay? And for each trip, he makes close to $150,000. He goes like once a week. So you can imagine the kind of money he's making. Okay? But at the same time, as he's protecting these convoys, he's notorious for causing all sorts of problems for the people on both sides of the road when these convoy travels. Cases of abducting women, of stealing people's land, really awful stuff. And so his actions are pushing people towards the Taliban, who are then going and firing at the convoys. Of course, the more Taliban firing at the convoys means you need more private security, so they're going and hiring this. It's an endless cycle. And this is sort of the system that's been put in place, conflict in perpetuity, with really no end in sight. At the same time, on the other side of things, the Taliban or the opposition forces in Afghanistan aren't united enough or aren't reflective enough of the national will to be able to resist the U.S. better kicking them out. I don't think we're going to see like a Saigon moment in Afghanistan where there's ambassadors jumping on the back of helicopters or anything like that. I don't think that's going to happen. The Taliban's not going to march into cities and kick them out. They're going to remain entrenched in the countryside and have this sort of level of violence, while the U.S. and their network of commanders and warlords are going to remain entrenched as well. So, minus some unforeseen reconfiguring of forces or the birth of an anti-war movement here or something else, I think unfortunately we're going to see this sort of situation exist for the next few years. So I think I'll leave it at that because you told me to keep it for 10 minutes.
No, you could go over.